What hand of fate doth lay a ruined orchard and a spent horse at a penniless man's threshold? And what secret, like a root deep buried, waits to choke or crown him? Hear now. The wind moves through hollow branches as if whispering lost names. The sun strikes on a rusted gate and turns iron to a small cold coin. A horse stands in shadow, flank scarred like a healed sword wound, nostrils like lamps that remember smoke. Elias, his boots threadbare, his pockets empty of more than a scrap of yesterday's bread and a single, folded photograph, comes to this place with calf aches and a grief that keeps slow time beneath his ribs. The orchard smells of old apples gone to cider and of rot that breeds both maggot and memory. A letter, yellowed and tremulous, had named him heir in a hand he once thought dead. The will was brief, the signature a name he had never truly meant to forget. Along with land came a creature, a stallion bowed and silent whose eyes knew things men have no license to ask. What price the secret the horse keeps? What cost the orchard's fruit? And what will Elias choose when the beast lifts the veil of what lies beneath the roots? The question hangs like a branch heavy with wormed fruit, and the answer waits. Patient, aching, and terrible. Elias had been a man of roads. He had measured seasons in hoofprints and the shallow cups of canned coffee. He had learned to read a stable's mood as others read scripture, yet the drift of his days had become small. Mending a fence, selling a horse's harness for a coin, sleeping beneath a roof that never forgave his absence. His father's hands, rough as split logs, left him one thing, the lesson that labor is a litany. Yet labor had not been mercy to Elias. It had been a mirror that showed him what he lacked. Grief, thin and polite, sat at his shoulder. He spoke of nothing. He wore his silence like a winter coat. The orchard arrived like a summons. It lay 3 hours from the town beyond a road that narrowed into a ribbon of dust. There the trees stood like old lieutenants, bowed, trunks furred with lichen, limbs mottled with fungus as if the soil itself had a fever. The gate was iron, once painted a hopeful green, now flaking like the skin of an autumn apple. A sign hung skewed, Morrow's Orchard, the letters stilled in a hand that time had stopped. Underneath the sign was a small nail, upon which hung a tame thing, an old leather bridle, one cheekpiece cracked, the noseband frayed. Elias's fingers closed on that bridle as if on a talisman. It smelled faintly of leather and dried sweat and a trace of lavender. Some nurse of horses had once visited. The house, low-roofed, half-sunken, gave him a single room with a stove that coughed more than warmed. In the kitchen drawer he found a folded paper whose edges bore a seal pressed in wax. The will named him heir to orchard and horse. The name at the bottom, the one that had sent the summons, was Abigail Morrow, his mother's sister, a woman whose voice had been rumor while he was a boy. Why she had sent such a thing, why the world should return this land, was a question that tasted like old coal in Elias's mouth. He had no coin for taxes, no medicine for time's slow teeth. He had only his hands and the stubbornness of a man that has nothing left to lose. He learned the rules of the place by doing. The orchard soil drank through the soles of his boots as he walked the rows. Earth compacted, roots strangled by ivy, irrigation lines ruptured like veins. There were boxes of rotten fruit he hauled to the compost heap. There were saplings choked with lichen. He pruned away with a saw that groaned. Each tree held a memory, children who once picked in sun-bright shirts, a winter of flood that the old neighbors still muttered about, a harvest that had failed. The orchard no longer fed a town. It fed only ghosts of yield. Thus daily life became prayer and punishment both. Elias rose before dawn to mend a fence and fed the chickens a handful of grain he measured with a calculus he had invented to make little last. He patched the roof with boards scavenged from a barn long given to collapse. At night he sat by the stove and opened the photograph he had kept, a picture of a woman with eyes like a river, his mother perhaps, or the sister he thought he had lost. He touched the image as if to test whether memory were solid. It wasn't, and that hurt more than cold. Something else lived among the limbs, a sense that the place expected him to do one of two things: revive the orchard or let it fall. There was no middle. He could sell the land for a handful of coin and go back to Rhodes, or he could stay and attempt a resurrection that required money he did not possess, and a strength perhaps he did not own. The letter had been clear in its silence. Abigail left with words enough to transfer title, but none to instruct the living. Her life deposited land. Her death had not deposited explanation. In the corner of the yard, behind a tumbled shed, Elias first saw the stallion. He had thought him a bale of shadow. The horse stood with one hind leg cocked, head low, eyes half closed like someone listening to a far-off bell. His flank bore a shuttered scar, a line white as a lightning-struck bone where hair refused to grow. A chain hung slack about one fetlock, the link smoothed by time but irritable with rust. The stallion's coat was the color of dried riverbed, ash with the last stains of a better life. When Elias stepped closer, the horse opened his eye and looked at him as if reading a long file of small sins and patient grievances. He did not neigh. He did not move. He only breathed, and his nostrils twitched like two small sails catching an old wind. Elias found a tack room where a tin box held a dozen keys, all different, all small. One key caught his hand. It was bent, its teeth worn. He held it up to the light and saw that a tiny crest was stamped upon it, a sprig half-eaten by time. He put the key in his pocket as one puts a prayer away. There was, somewhere beneath the orchard's roots, a story that the animal seemed to know but would not tell. Elias felt with a clarity that made his chest ache that the horse and the land were kin to a secret. He slept that night with the bridle at his feet and the key under his mattress, neither of which kept him from a dream in which a voice called his name, and then stilled. The first mornings were a study in mistrust. Elias approached the stallion with an apron of oats in his hand. The beast watched him as if the man were an old creditor. He would not let Elias touch his flank where the white scar split him. Every time Elias reached, the horse flinched, snapping his head away with an instinct born of pain. Elias adjusted. He learned to sit upon a bale and without word feed the horse with fingers flat, letting the animal take the grain without fear. The stallion accepted the food but not the palm. He kept his weight behind the chain, his ears folded like guarded books. When Elias hummed a tune, the beast's lip twitched with suspicion. When Elias whistled, the horse's eye narrowed. So the man changed his music, lowering it to a semblance of prayer, and each day he tried again. Neighbors came like weather, some breeze, some gale. Old Meeks from the lane offered to buy a few trees. Bartholomew Barlow, who owned the next parcel and a manor like a locked gate, came with a letter held stiff between finger and thumb. Barlow spoke of taxes unpaid, of liens, and of men who would be glad to buy the orchard at auction. His smile was a blade hidden in a lover's glove. Land is good for those who keep watch, he said, but gooder still for those who claim it. Elias's jaw clenched. He had no law to answer with, only a stubbornness that tasted of dry bread. A storm came quicker than the law. Clouds gathered at midday, black as a smith's belly. Rain, hammering like drumbeats, turned the lane to a river of quick mud. The orchard groaned. Limbs bowed, and one old apple tree, fat with rot, leaned like a man about to confess. In the thunder, the stallion behaved strangely. Ears forward, nostrils wide, a low whinny like a door opening in winter. Lightning struck, distant then nearer, and for a heartbeat the sky lay open. When the storm passed, Elias found part of the fence down in water pooling by the root of the oldest tree. In the mud near a toppled fence post, the stallion pawed and then pawed again as if to show Elias something. Elias followed the animal's hoof marks until he saw, half bared by churned earth, the edge of a wooden box. He knelt, palms muddy, and found nails that gave with a certain old stubbornness. The lid came free with a smell of cedar and earth. Inside lay a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. Elias's hands trembled as he unfolded it. There was a letter whose ink had browned with age and a strip of fabric the color of a midnight sky. The letter's first line read, "To he who will live where roots remember names." The paper spoke in a hand both fierce and tender. It spoke of debts not of coin but of promise. Of an orchard once tended to feed a town through a winter of want. Of a pact sealed by those who tended both land and beast. There was a name signed at the bottom, a name Elias had not heard since childhood. It was Abigail's name again. The fabric, when unrolled, revealed a crest identical to that on the bent key in his pocket, a sprig with 3 leaves. A new question arrived like a hired messenger. What had been buried and why? The letter hinted at something beneath the 3rd root from the west gate, at a place where the land drank slow and deep. It mentioned storms and a stallion that would show the way if the heart were true. Elias looked at the horse, who had laid his head upon the muddy ground, and watched him with an intelligence that was almost conversational. The beast snorted as if amused, and then he stamped, sending a spray of water over the letter and the cloth and Elias's fingers. The paper darkened at the edge but held its words. The sprig of fabric was damp and smelled of root hollows. By then, men came with more than words. A notice nailed to his door bore the county's stamp. Overdue taxes. A sheriff would post for sale should funds not be paid. Barlow's visits became longer. He ate with the meager hospitality Elias could offer, and spoke of auctioneers as if naming birds. Elias's nights grew short with worry. He tried through the day to coax the stallion toward the west gate, walking the animal with a halter that hesitated at every post. The horse moved like a general reluctant to charge, measuring, testing, making calculations that were not the man's. At the third attempt, the stallion suddenly jolted. He reared, not in fear but in recognition, nostrils flaring at a scent only he could read. He pulled Elias toward a gnarl of roots where the earth rose like the back of some sleeping creature. There the beast pawed, not with the aimless fury of a frightened animal, but with the exactitude of a hand that knows how to unlace a knot. He scraped, and then he scraped again, until wood showed pale and a ring of iron peered from the soil. Elias's breath left him. He found, wedged beneath a root, another key, smaller. Shaped to a lock his bent key might open, its teeth black with age yet keen. This discovery should have bought a short relief, but it bought instead a more cunning trouble. The key and the letter and the horse's behavior formed a map of hope, and hope in a place where men like Barlow watched with ledger eyes is an invitation. Word traveled. How, Elias could not say. Perhaps Meeks had a tongue. Perhaps the wind wanted coin. The sheriff's clerk, a man of small face and large appetite, came with a polite knock and a polite demand for payment. Elias set the letter beneath his palm and told the clerk he would sell a few trees, plant anew, harvest apples in the next year. The clerk's smile froze like an iron coin. He left a paper that smelled of authority. That night a stranger came in the rain. Feet hit the porch with a sound like a dropped sack. The man wore a coat too fine for the orchard's customs. He introduced himself as a representative of one who claimed title through a chain of sales. Barlow's advantage, the man said, as if he were naming a spice. He asked for papers. Elias gave him the will and the letter, and watched the stranger read. The man's eyes shifted over the paper and then to the horse tethered at the post. He laughed, a small brittle sound. Men with such things usually find they own less than the soil demands, he said. He left behind, tucked under the will, a photograph of a younger Abigail. She had been bright as a bell, and on the back, in a hurried hand, a scrawl Elias did not know. Keep away from the well. Elias's sleep that night was cut with the thudding of hooves in his chest. He rose at dawn to find that someone had cut the wire of the south fence. The orchard's boundary had been pierced. A note lay at the gate, an anonymous warning. The ink was quick and cruel. Sell now or you will lose all. Elias pressed his fists into the paper until the fibers broke. He took the note, the letter, and the 2 keys, and he went to the stallion. The animal's breathing was slow, almost ceremonial. Elias, hands steadier than they had been, took the halter, and the leather felt like a hand passed down through generations. He led the horse to the west gate where the third root rose. The stallion stopped. He dipped his head, and then, with a motion so sudden and sure it felt like lightning catching sea, he struck the ground with his forehoof, not to wound, but to open. The soil gave, and a hollow exhaled. Elias leaned forward, and with the smaller key pried at a rusted iron ring. The ring yielded with a sound like a secret unfastening. Beneath the ring, the darkness was not black but full of a smell, peat and apple sap and cold iron. The stallion breathed into that dark and, with a nudge, pushed Elias's hand down to feel what lay beneath. His fingers brushed wood and then fabric, then the final edge of something that did not belong to the earth. Elias reached deeper and closed his fingers around a small box. It was not heavy, yet it felt like a world. He lifted it. The lid, loosened by the horse's persistent nudging, came away, and inside he found, folded into a cloth the color of old night, a single object that stopped his breath, a small iron key the size of a man's thumb, and, beneath it, a ring engraved with the same sprig of 3 leaves. The stallion stamped the ground, eyes bright as if a candle had been struck. Elias set the ring on his palm, and in that moment the world tilted, not with triumph but with the sense of a hinge moving. The ring bore, tucked within its engravings, a cipher, letters that, when Elias squinted, formed a name he had not expected to see. It was Abigail's full name, and beneath it a date. The date was a memory. The day the orchard had been promised to a covenant, the day someone had buried a trust in the soil. Before Elias could speak, a shout split the air. Men came at a run through the lane. Barlow's men, faces set like broken locks, and behind them Barlow himself, coat flaring, voice a belligerent trumpet. "You meddle where you have no right," he called. He held a paper that was new and assertive, and his eyes rested upon the ring like a hawk on prey. The stallion bared his teeth, not to bite but in a gesture of warning, and pawed the earth. Elias felt the keys grow heavy in his pockets, the letters paper thin as a blade between his fingers. The ground beneath them seemed to inhale, and the orchard waited with a patience that had begun long before any of these men were born. Barlow stepped forward, and there, in the hush that follows thunder, he pointed to the ring and spoke a name that turned Elias's blood to ice. The name was not Abigail's. It was not even a name Elias expected. It was the name of a debt, of a crime whispered in taverns. It was a promise of ruin. Elias opened his mouth to answer, but the stallion's low whinny swallowed the word. The man at the orchard's gate lifted a hand, and something in the valley shifted toward a choice from which there could be no return. The horse stamped, the keys clinked, and beneath the roots a secret stirred. Thunder had not yet finished with the sky when men spilled from hedgerow and lane, boots sunk in slop and faces set like forged iron. Barlow strode first, his coat beaten by rain, his voice a bell meant to frighten. He raised the paper and called law over him as one might call the wind to one's hand. "This ring," he said, eyes hunting Elias's palm, "bears no right to challenge men who keep accounts." His cronies closed like a net. Elias held the smaller key and the ring as if they were a prayer he had never learned to say aloud. The ledger, damp at one corner, lay open on his knee. Abigail's hand, bold, crooked, impossibly alive, stared up at him from each line. The entries were not only in ink but in habit, names of men who had been paid, of taxes withheld, of sums delivered to hands that did not belong to Barlow. One sheet bore a notation that made Elias's pulse leap. "When storm unseals the west root, let truth breathe forth. Keep the horse as witness." The phrasing was Abigail's, abrupt, stubborn, kind. Barlow laughed then, a brittle, small thing that wanted to be thunder. "Paper is a feather beside a sheriff's writ," he sneered. "Your letter and your trinkets will not fill a county ledger." He stepped forward, fingers curled like talons. His hand strayed to the hilt of a pocket knife. His men's eyes gleamed with the thought of quick coin if the orchard fell to auction. Rain ran from their hats in dark lines. The stallion's ears pricked. He shifted his weight like a man changing his mind. Then he did a thing Elias had not seen in a beast of his years. With a sound that was neither neigh nor complaint, more a long inhalation of memory, the horse planted one forehoof and then raised it, not in temper, but in recognition. He struck the ground, a single blow that shattered the orchard's quiet like a bell cracking open. The soil gave beneath his hoof, and where iron ring and smaller key had met, a fretwork of roots unlatched and a hollow breathed its ancient cold. Barlow's men cursed and leaned forward. The rain thickened to a curtain. Elias, heedless of the storm, slipped the small iron key into a rusted hasp he had found beneath the roots. The lock yielded with a long, patient sigh, as if the land itself exhaled the secret it had kept. Wood came away, and a shaft of dimness showed itself. There, packed in cedar and oilcloth, lay a chest whose lid carried the same sprig as the ring. The chest was light in Elias's hands, but heavy with consequence. He lifted the lid and the ledger tumbled free, wet pages flipping like a wounded bird. Underneath, bound in waxed cloth, lay a bundle of papers, deeds, and receipts, a promissory written by Barlow himself, and countersigned by men whose names matched the ledger's entries. Abigail's last page, where she had written a phrase meant as both lock and key, spoke plainly. "This orchard shall stand as trust to shelter the poor and pay what must. To perjure this is to perjure our town." The ink had not faded in the heart of the chest because the land had kept it safe. A man behind Barlow, impatient and close to greed, lunged. Fingers found the ledger's edge. He meant to snatch and run. He meant to tear. But the stallion, slow as a memory, sure as a man, slammed himself between Elias and the lunging hand. His broad chest met the man's flank. The man stumbled, cursing, and in that stumble he exposed a wrist branded at the inner fold with a mark that matched the sprig on the ring. 3 leaves looped in a crude design. The brand was old, the scar puckered like the map of a small island. Eyes flashed. Barlow heard it first. A sound like a man hearing his own name in a whisper when he thought himself masked. He recoiled, and for a moment the rain held its breath. "You insolent," he began, but words muddled when his men's faces changed from hunger to recognition. One of them, Meeks's nephew who had been to tavern in town, had seen such a brand before in the margins of a ledger that mattered. He pointed, voice breaking like thin ice. "That's the mark from the night account. Barlow took their money and branded those who kept silent." The phrase fell like a stone into the muddy air. Barlow swore, eyes narrowing into a knife's edge. He snapped a name at Elias, a name of old debt, of theft covered by silence, but the world had shifted. The ledger, Abigail's hand, the ring, and the brand stood together like witnesses. Men began to murmur, uncertain whether to stand with the man who plundered or with the proof that could choke him. The stranger who had left the photograph days earlier came from the lane then, coat plastered with rain, his boots carrying town's dust. He had been sent, Elias later learned, by a magistrate who trusted a clerk's gut and a clerk's reputation. The stranger spoke with an authority that smelled of paper and seat-of-pants justice. "The clerk will read," he said, not asking. He threw a folded notice to the ground. The sheriff, called and briefed, was on his way. It was a thin comfort. The threat had teeth that did not sleep until law's iron found them. Barlow's temper snapped like a brittle twig. He drew himself up and moved to seize the chest, to rend the ledger apart and hide what it proved. Elias stood before him, the ring warm in his fist, and saw in Barlow not only greed but a man who had been allowed to believe himself invincible. The choice shone like a blade. Yield the orchard and the horse, or stand and risk the man's wrath. Elias felt the town's old ghosts, men who had been robbed, families left to winter, press his back like hands. He thought of Abigail's line about trust and the poor. He thought of his own father's litany that labor is a litany because it is holy work. He stepped forward. In the shove that followed, a man's temper frayed into violence. Hands grabbed, claws scraped, and the stallion, in a single motion that read as both doom and devotion, lunged. He did not bite or strike with malice. He shoved his shoulder into Barlow's chest, a living battering ram. Barlow staggered under it, curse spitting like sparks. One of his men, hungrier than sense, drew a small knife and slashed at the horse's flank. The blade bit fabric and skin. The stallion reared, a great shadow against the sullen sky, then crashed to the sod with a thud like an oaken door. Silence snapped. A hush came that had nothing to do with weather. The horse lay still, breath coming in shallow ropes. Blood shone against his ash coat like iron warmed by fire. Elias felt the world shrink to the sound of his own heart and the stallion's breathing. He knelt and wrapped his hands in the horse's mane, fingers finding the place where the knife had cheated the flesh. The animal's eye, wide and lucent, found his. In that look lay a covenant older than ink. Barlow, who had meant to terrorize, now faced a new reckoning. The men, seeing the horse's blood and the ledger in Elias's lap, wavered. The stranger's shout ripped through the orchard like an axe. "Hold!" He gestured at the road, and in the breath between thunder and silence the sheriff's cart rattled into view. Men in blue and gray, faces set, gospel of authority in their hands. The clerk arrived behind them, eyes bright with the certainty of law backed by evidence. When the sheriff read Abigail's ledger, his gaze snapped to Barlow. "You stand accused," he said, "of fraud and intimidation." Barlow's color left him like dye in rain. Barlow spat, then fell back. The weight of proof had toppled what menace could not. Arrests were made amidst curses that tried to pass for dignity. Hands cuffed Barlow, then his men, then the one who had slashed the horse. The crowd, neighbors, the stranger, Meeks with his flannel hat, began to breathe as if a long-held bellows were finally allowed to exhale. Elias stayed at the stallion's side. He held the animal's head in his lap like a child. The rain washed tracks of iron down the horse's flank. The stallion's breathing was thin but steady. His eye closed briefly and opened again. When the sheriff had put Barlow in the cart, and when law had driven the men to town like fruit bound for judgment, the orchard felt very still, as if the land were listening to the stallion's heart. Elias kissed the animal's forehead then, an act that was more vow than comfort. "Thou art a brave old idiot," he murmured, voice raw. "But the world owes thee more than a bruise." The stallion snorted, a sound like a promise, and rested his head against Elias's cheek as if to bind them further. When the storm had spent its anger, neighbors came with tools and hands like blessings. Meeks and his wife brought bandages and stout spirits. The stranger returned with a medic from town who knew how to stitch and soothe. The wound in the stallion's flank was mended with a skill that smelled of vinegar and patience. Elias, who had never been wealthy in coin, found his wealth in the people who came with steady feet and steady hands. They set to work not only to heal a body, but to repair the orchard that had been rent by greed and neglect. The ledger, now safe in the clerk's hands, did more than accuse. It returned coin where coin had flown. Townsfolk who had been owed found their names inked in Abigail's handwriting. Promises long silenced now spoke in sums. A magistrate read the ledger aloud in the town square, and neighbors learned what had been done in corners where greed takes root. Barlow's property was sequestered, restitution was ordered, and the sheriff took measures to ensure the county's coffers were not left wanting. The law was not a magic that cured all, but it was a net that caught enough of the men who had slipped through. Elias refused pay in coin for the chest's contents. He offered instead to take what Abigail had left in trust for seasonal wages and to plant the orchard true. The town agreed with something like wonder that a man without purse could promise to make good. They lent him seed, a loan that was more neighborly than legal, and a man named Turner offered an old plow for the first furrow. Little by little, the orchard's wounds were tended, a fence mended, root rot trimmed, drainage relayed to swallow winter water and spit it away. The work was honest and slow. It was the kind of work that pays in roots and in tomorrow. The stallion recovered in time that calcined pain into something like pride. He favored the leg a while, then stood tall as a mast, ears pricked for the smallest sound. Children, who had come in secret to watch the drama, began to visit by the afternoon. They fed the animal carrots and apples, the fruit of a tree not yet given to harvest but spared from compost for joy. The horse let them near, his head lowered like a blessing, and a small girl braided the loose mane where the blade had shaved hair. Her fingers were nimble, and the stallion closed his eyes with a softness that made Elias's throat ache. In the evenings, Elias read Abigail's letters. She had been more than a proprietor. She had been a woman with a knack for covenant, for matching promises with patience. Her handwriting scrawled of a plan, to keep the orchard as both livelihood and shelter, to stand against men who would buy and sell in a way that starved the neighbors. The chest's contents were a map of duty. It demanded not only proof but action. Elias felt in those lines Abigail's fierce tenderness as if she sat across his stove and tapped her finger for attention. When the sheriff returned Barlow's men to town to face justice, rumors began to shift like new leaves. Some men who had kept quiet came forward, frightened at first, then relieved as the ledger's light exposed their shackles. Payments were made in part, not always in full. The orchard's taxes were negotiated down by a sympathetic clerk who recognized the truth beneath the ink. Elias did what he could with what he had. He paid a first tax in labor, fixing a road for the county in exchange for time to harvest his first small crop. It was a barter, awkward like an old dance, but it kept the orchard from immediate auction, and love of the gentle, practical kind breathed into the place. A woman named Ruth, who kept the town's bakery and wore soot like a halo, came with loaves and sharp eyes. She had known Abigail's charity. She had tasted the orchard's apples when children had run from school on certain bright days. She stayed to press cider with Elias on slow afternoons, hands working in shared rhythm. They spoke little at first. They learned the rhythm of a place together like a couple of plow horses learning the same furrow. When they spoke, it was in small truths. About weather, about seeds, about the stubbornness of fruit that will not take to a graft. In the evenings they sat by the stove and Elias read Abigail aloud, their voices threading through quiet. The town's children learned the orchard's name anew, Morrow's Orchard, a place that might feed a winter if given time, and they made pilgrimages with small baskets. They planted a tree each spring, a small rebellion against the quickness of greed. The first harvest after the storm was meager but honest, apples that tasted like rain and second chances. Elias sold enough to pay the next tax quarter and kept enough to seed the hollows. The chest beneath the root had not been only a salvation but a contract, to keep the orchard for the town as Abigail had intended. At night, Elias would go to the stallion and sit with palms on a flank that had once borne a blade. He would speak of the ledger, of the men who had been made to answer and of the odd mercy that had tangled his life to this place. The horse listened, one ear cupped to the world, as if understanding the human law that had no weight in his world. He would occasionally nudge Elias's hand, as if to correct a compass, reminding him that the land mattered more than the ledger, that work mattered more than law, that affection mattered more than coin. The town changed. People who had once thought only of the next harvest learned to think of the third and fourth. They taught their children more carefully to graft and to prune, to spot a disease before it gnawed through a tree. Elias taught some of them to read the weather in the way a horse reads a man. He showed them that animals like contracts remember what men tell them and will act when memory is pressed. One spring morn, when frost still licked the air but sunlight had the boldness of a promise, the orchard showed the color of hope. Buds swelled like small moons on limbs that had once been declared dead. A haze of blossom scent lifted like soft laughter across the rows. Elias walked the lanes with the stallion at his side, the animal's step even, his weight a metronome that beat steady for a world that had known storm. The final act of the day came not as a trumpet, but as a small, one-handed gesture. The stallion, who had once unlatched a secret with a hoof and whose wound had been tended by many hands, led Elias to the very west route beneath which Abigail had hidden her chest. There, where the land had once given up its secret, the horse paused. He dipped his head and nudged the soil with his nose, an old habit of sniffing for salt or bone, and then, as if to offer thanks or to receive final absolution, he laid his forehead against Elias's shoulder. Elias placed the ring upon the stallion's bridle. It fit the leather as if it had been meant to be there, an emblem that bound man, land, and beast in a circle. Children gathered at a respectful distance, hats in hands. Ruth stood by with cider in a wooden bowl, her smile like the first light. The neighbors formed a loose semicircle, not as jurors but as witnesses to a covenant renewed. Abigail's ledger remained in the clerk's safe. The town had made it a public thing, a lesson taught every harvest. Yet what the ledger could not show, the tenderness that binds a man to a beast, the stubbornness that keeps a tree from being felled, was visible in the simple procession through the rows. The stallion moved like a prophet that knew the language of roots. Elias walked beside him as companion and keeper. They passed saplings planted by small hands. They passed a new fence where Meeks and Turner had worked until their knuckles bruised. They passed the well where the stranger's warning, "Keep away from the well," had been a caution meant less for danger than for truth. There were triumphant moments. The orchard produced a harvest the following autumn greater than many had dared hope, enough to pay remaining dues and to stock a pantry for winter. Barlow's attempt to return via legal chicanery failed. The ledger and the town's memory were a stronger law than any of his forged papers. The men who had aided him paid restitution and, in time, labored in public works until trust, slow as sap, returned to them. Elias's change was quiet and complete. He was still a man of roads in the bones that made him. His fingers still knew the rhythm of a rope and the tongue of a bridle, yet he carried within him a different ledger, one not written in ink but in small acts of attention. He forgave when forgiveness meant repair. He held others accountable when law demanded it. He loved with the practical ardor of those who feed others with bread and shelter. The stallion grew old as a tree grows old, patiently, with seasons embedded in his gait. He lived long enough to see a foal born to a mare from the town, a young horse whose coat shone like new copper. The foal learned to tail the older beast as one learns to follow a path in the grass. On an evening when the moon was a blade of silver set in black velvet, the stallion walked to the orchard's highest row. He turned once and looked upon the swells of trees and the small houses beyond, then lifted his head and breathed deep as if to drink the whole scene into his lungs. Elias watched him and felt that the orchard, the horse and the town had given him what coin could not, a place earned and earned again, and a sense of belonging that did not depend on paper but on work, and on the honesty of a man's hands. He took the bridle, and with a gesture he had learned from Abigail's letters, one of rough reverence, he fitted the ring again, this time upon a post at the orchard's gate. It glinted like a promise. The ledger's last page bore Abigail's final line, which Elias read aloud at harvest. "Tend the roots as thou wouldst tend a life. Work and faith make harvest of strangers." He paused then, eyes on the stallion who stood like an old sentinel. Elias turned his face to the assembled neighbors and children and, With a voice that went as plain and true as a bell, he said, "This orchard was not mine alone." His mouth shaped the word with gratitude that tasted like cider. The stallion stepped forward and, in a gesture so small it might have been missed by any who watched with less care, he lowered his head and allowed the smallest child to touch his nose. The child's hand trembled. The animal's breath warmed the young palm. In that touch lay the payoff of all. Fear met with courage, debt met with mercy, wounds healed with work. The town clapped, a sound like slow thunder, and as applause bloomed, the horse lifted his head and whuffled, a small, hoarse sound and more, a final benediction. Elias stayed late that night beside the gate, looking out over rows that now promised fruit. The air held the last of the day's warmth. He thought of Abigail, of the ledger, of the ring in the chest and the way the stallion had known how to unseal roots. He thought of the small girl who had braided the mane. He thought with a kind of humble awe that every secret kept by the land had a way of being told if only someone would listen. At last, he spoke a line that felt like the closing of a long account, and it slipped from him like a bell's last note. If a man keeps faith with earth and beast, he keeps it with himself, and thus shall sorrow bruise into bread. The words fell soft and certain and lingered in the orchard air. If this tale of root and ring and a brave, blood-wounded horse hath stirred thy heart, subscribe and join us anon. Press the bell that it may toll when another old secret is unburied. Leave thy thoughts below. What wouldst thou do in Elias's boots? And share this tale with one who loves songs of land and loyalty, that the story may travel as an apple does from hand to hungry hand.